Hello and welcome back to Instant Insights. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Carolina Pinto, and today I'm joined with Chris Granville, Managing Director of Global Political Research. Chris, how are you?
Fine, Carolina. Thanks for having us on.
No problem. And also, I forgot to say, from our macroeconomic branch, TS Lombard, and also from TS Lombard, Grace Fan, Head of Global Policy and Disruptive Themes. Grace, how are you?
All well, thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you both for joining me today. Once again, we are talking about the Trump tariffs. Just as a prerequisite, we are recording this on Thursday afternoon, 10th of July. This episode comes out on Monday, the 14th. So obviously, most of the things we will talk about will be relevant, but just a warning that some things may change in between now and Monday. But just to catch up the audience on what's been going on with the Trump tariffs, we had a pause on the reciprocal tariffs that were announced in April. We had a 90-day pause. That came to an end yesterday or today, depending on how you count it. And now that pause has been extended until August the 1st. We've had a series of trade negotiations going on with the two most relevant, excluding China, the trade deals that have been agreed, the UK and Vietnam. But in all of this tariff situation, this changing dynamics, I wanted to ask both Chris and Grace, what are your key takeaways from the last 90 days?
Well, should I have a start? I'll make a start with more of a kind of backdrop painting exercise, Carolina, and then hand smartly over to Grace, who is a master of the detail on this very fast-moving picture. And as you say, Carolina, we are making this podcast recording in the thick of things. But stepping back from all these dramatic headlines, the generalization that I would seek to draw would be to say that this is a world-changing event, but not in the sense of some general collapse. The basis of global trade built up since the Second World War have for sure been overturned. And this is a culmination of a breakdown of the multilateral trading order, which has been in progress for many long years, dating back certainly to the first Trump administration, if not before. But we're not seeing, this doesn't entail or presage an absolute breakdown. That would have been the case, for example, if the tit-for-tat trade war between the US and China in those dramatic weeks of last April and May had stuck. But the telling thing is that they did not. The costs were too high for all concerned, and the situation was walked back into the truce situation, which we now have. But it is nevertheless, even if we assume that such flare-ups, which may well recur with China and or other major trading partners, will similarly be walked back in the end, because the economic cost is untenable, and ultimately the political cost for the Trump administration itself and for counterparties. However, even if we assume that deals are worked out in the end, then it's still a radical change in the global trading, investment, and economic picture. The average external tariff of the US for many long decades, around 1%, maximum 2%, and that was about the level at the end of last year, will most likely end up something like around 10%, plus minus a few percentage points. That is a big shift to protectionism. And the results will have profound impacts on the way that companies and investors allocate resources, think about their supply chains, and respond to and preempt and anticipate risks. So just with that kind of generalization, I'll hand over perhaps to Grace to have a go at your first question.
Thanks, Chris. So I would add that zooming in from that framework to really the second quarter of this year, we have to remember that Trump has had a fairly successful run of the past 3 months. For example, he's passed his big, beautiful bill by his own self-imposed deadline of Independence Day. He's bombed Iran without spiking crude oil prices. And that first 100-day mark, which saw his approval rating crater, in part because of the Liberation Day tariffs, his net approval rating was down 9 to 10 percentage points, has also more or less stabilized as of the last polls. They've ticked up perhaps 3 or so percentage points. And of course, to take Trump's favorite barometer, US equities, they are at or near record highs, with NVIDIA being the first company ever to cross the $4 trillion mark in market capitalization. So, in that context, when we look at what's happened on trade, Trump is obviously feeling pretty cocky from his string of recent wins, even using Trump's own metrics in terms of him being a master deal maker. He has really come up short. And so, to take your point and Carolina's point, he has not only failed to make 90 deals in 90 days, but he's just blinked again by extending that 90-day pause for 3 weeks. And then if you take the top 15 countries that run the biggest trade deficits with the US, that Treasury Secretary Bessent has famously called the Dirty 15, Trump has only been able to wrangle a deal with one of them, Vietnam. The rest remain outstanding, though. As we record, there are rumors that perhaps a deal with the EU, which runs the second largest trade deficit with the US, could be imminent. So stay tuned. Perhaps this will have already happened, or perhaps it'll have been kicked down the road. But finally, and most importantly, perhaps, Trump has suffered a huge setback in the lower courts with a unanimous ruling from the US Court of International Trade in late May that struck down Trump's Liberation Day and fentanyl tariffs on the grounds that they were unlawful. These are the IEEPA tariffs, those imposed under emergency powers that, since the decision, an appellate court quickly issued an emergency stay to pause the lower court ruling. But when all said and done, going back to Trump's 3 main tariff goals, reindustrialization, tariff revenues, and maximum leverage, we can see from all 3 of them, he has lost ground on all 3. And so coming to, these 3 weeks ahead of the August 1st deadline, Trump has a lot of ground to make up.
I think, Grace, that's a very good point, that there's both obviously a foreign aspect to these tariffs, but there's a lot of going at play domestically as well. Going into more of the deals that have been made, there is not many of. Both of you looking at these deals, that being the UK's deal with the US and Vietnam, what do these deals tell us about the Trump administration's negotiation tactics, what concessions they can make, etc.?
I would say, do you want to go first, Chris?
No, Grace, you go first this time.
Well, you are the resident Brit. So perhaps you should tackle the UK deal and I can take the Vietnam deal.
Okay, well, the UK, I think the absolutely cardinal feature of the UK deal was that what is called the 10% baseline tariff, simply a blanket tariff on all imports into the US from the trading partner country, stood and was accepted by the UK in exchange for some concessions and tariff-free quotas on certain of the goods that had been subject to another category of tariffs known collectively as the national security tariffs, things like autos, steel, and so on. So what does that tell you? It tells you, in my mind, that the Trump administration, when all is said and done and all the sound and fury has died down somewhat, is after a moderate protectionist wall. Moderate, that's perhaps a controversial word. I mean, a very high protectionist wall compared to the historical record, as I mentioned before, but still well short of some of these dramatic tariffs that were announced on so-called Liberation Day back in early April. So I think, to your question, Carolina, this UK deal does have the makings of a template which we could see replicated with, of course, several and no doubt in some cases complex variations in the case of other trading partners, including the really important ones like Japan and the EU. With that, over to you, Grace, on Vietnam.
So the Vietnam deal does follow the UK deal in terms of setting up another framework, possibly for ASEAN countries. And that is that to backtrack, Vietnam got among the highest Liberation Day tariffs of the tariff list that Trump unleashed. So 46% tariff, really high, near the 49%. That was among the highest, I believe. And from that point, Vietnam negotiated temporarily down to 20% tariff, so more than halved that initial tariff rate in its deal. At the same time, it agreed, again, verbally speaking, that for any Chinese transshipments or transshipments by third countries, meaning China, via Vietnam to the US, it would slap a 40% tariff onto those goods. So, in a nutshell, the Trump administration, as had the Biden administration before it, has been trying to close back doors to Chinese imports via third countries. And the Vietnam Framework Agreement is their first attempt to really try and close that back door. Last but not least, on the Vietnam front, one possible aid to them securing a deal was that they fast-tracked a lot of Trump international real estate deals, including a hotel deal and a new golf course. And that, as much as anything, might have sweetened the pot in terms of getting that deal across the finish line.
And Grace, can I just quickly just clarify one thing? Is it a reflection, I believe, of the very high economic stakes for Vietnam is the fact that alongside that reduced but still high tariff which will be imposed on imports from Vietnam into the United States, Vietnam itself has accepted a zero tariff for any US imports into Vietnam. And other countries, ASEAN or elsewhere, I mean, they can't outbid that.
Yeah, I think the UK has as well. So I think the expectation, at least for now, is the 0% on US imports into these countries. But looking elsewhere beyond the UK and Vietnam, I mean, I have two questions really. So we have this deadline on August 1st. Is the deadline realistic, or are we going to get to July 31st and the can's going to be kicked down the road once again? Both, is that deadline realistic, and what can we expect after August 1st, really?
So I would say that taking the view of US domestic political drivers as Trump's framework, the clock is really ticking not just for US trading partners, but also for the Trump administration. And so let me lengthen that timeline a bit by looking at other future calendar dates that the Trump administration absolutely has in mind. First of all, we mentioned the appellate courts now have that IEEPA tariff decision. That court decision is set for oral hearings on July 31st. So not coincidentally right before your August 1st deadline. And an initial court decision is expected to come as early as mid-August or September on those Liberation Day fentanyl tariffs. So should the appellate court rule against Trump, it would obviously not only blow this bazooka-wide hole in his current trade strategy, but automatically put a large chunk of those $100 billion plus revenues that Bessent has touted that the Treasury has received to date all of a sudden a large chunk of that vanishes. So what does that mean going forward? The Trump administration is likely to immediately appeal for another emergency stay from the Supreme Court. So it could live to fight another day. But as we've already seen, Trump is pivoting to already address these issues. For example, in both the Canada and Brazil tariff threats that we've seen recently, he hasn't mentioned IEEPA, those emergency power tariffs, in his threat to them. In fact, he's mentioned Section 301, which actually requires a months-long investigation first and might actually come up empty in the end. Of course, there's no guarantee that the appellate court and the Supreme Court will automatically toss out these IEEPA tariffs, but I would say I have pretty high confidence that even if they didn't, it would be time constrained. And then on top of this, I would mention two other things we've already mentioned. The US-China trade truce would also expire on or around August 12th. Whatever happens with those rest of world deals and whatever happens between US-China will affect these other trade deals. So we've mentioned in past webinars and past publications, this is very much like a game of musical chairs for these US trading partners, in which when the music stops, whoever doesn't have a chair gets left out. And so there is this scramble to find that chair. But if China gets a chair, then all of a sudden, all other US trading partners are disproportionately negatively affected. Meanwhile, for the time being, for example, we haven't even mentioned Mexico and Canada, North America, really being not only the third biggest trade deficit region for the USMCA, but also fast-track USMCA negotiations should start in the fourth quarter. If the US-Canada negotiations go well. But that being said, Mexico was recently celebrating the Vietnam-US deal, because if that enshrines a 20% tariff, then Mexico benefits by default from having that USMCA zone, at least for now. Again, all of this pits all these other countries against each other. And then finally, before throwing it over to you, last but not least, far away, 16 months away, but again, midterm elections and the countdown to the midterm elections really put a hard stop on all of this trade deal making for the Trump administration. So we could go past the August 1st deadline, but I would say a hard stop would be by the end of this year.
Chris, do you have any final thoughts on the August 1st deadline?
You know what, Carolina, there was such a rich material there from Grace that got nothing to add or subtract, except perhaps to leave our audience with the clear takeaways that this is a path that will end in several major deals, one or two exclamations of "you're fired," but a situation designed to get the reality TV host the round of applause and a sense of the US economy being back on track. But when all is said and done, and the dust settles to some extent at least, it's still a very different picture of a more protectionist world, which in principle would be necessary to make progress towards the stated goal of some reindustrialization of the United States economy. And the lack of a legal basis for that generalized baseline tariff, that even protectionist wall, is, I think, one of the big issues to follow in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely, and I think uncertainty will definitely continue for the foreseeable future. But thank you so much, Grace and Chris, for joining me on the podcast. And from everyone at home, thank you for listening. And from us at Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.